Welcome to Margin Reform's client webinar session. They've extended UMR again. What can you solve now? My name is Juliet Carter, and I'm the founder of Carter Consulting, a B2B marketing consultancy for startups and SMEs. I've been working with Margin Reform over the past 9 months, and I'm delighted to moderate this webinar. So here's the agenda for today. First, we would like to give you an overview of Margin Reform, including the services that we offer. We will then be discussing the high-level macro view of what has happened with collateral in the last quarter, followed by which a discussion about the key regulatory updates. We will share one of our clients' reactions to the UMR extension. And for the industry chit-chat, we'll look at the industry news that we found interesting in the past weeks. And then we'll talk through a recent white paper and a collateral survey for the buy side. And lastly, we'll leave 15 minutes for a live Q&A. So I do hope you enjoyed the webinar today. I will pass it on to my colleague, Sean.
Thank you, Juliet. Juliet, just before we get going, I think Chen's video might be stuck and you might need to turn him on under the participants panel. Thank you. So for those that don't know me, I'm Sean Murray. I'm the CEO of Margin Reform. We are a boutique consultancy. We have been in business around 18 months. Sept and I have been working together for over 10 years in various guises at a couple of different organisations. We're the partners of Margin Reform. So I propose today just to walk you through what we do, who we are, how we do it, and the makeup of our team. And then we're going to get into some of the agenda as Juliet suggested. So we're 18 months into our journey, as I say, and we've got a broad range of professional services, which are all focused in and around collateral, margin and legal, which is where our strengths are. I'm going to walk you through very briefly what those services are and what they actually mean to the industry. So the first circle starting at the top is clearing margin and collateral. And that really is about considering your long-term vision, your long-term strategy for your front to back collateral setup. It could involve overarching collateral frameworks. It could be technology decisions or strategic setup for your business or for your operational area. It's not a one size fits all, and it really is about how you view collateral and your starting point today. The second point is about markets and trading. So we've done some work with people on front pre-trade analytics, so sort of pre-optimization before you execute, and also on post-trade, so looking at optimization post-trade of post-derivative trade, and then looking at collateral as you're posting it to your clients. It could be something as simple as treasury or liquidity funding, or something very more intricate, such as securities lending and a securities lending business, and how that might look for somebody who might want to start a securities lending business. They could be looking at a business case or a feasibility study. Third point is around risk and regulation, and it is what it says. It's G20 reg reforms, and amongst other things, some risk disciplines as well. Could be discovery workshops or project initiation and implementation. And one of our favourites is SIM governance, and the SIM model is obviously a hot topic for UMR. And we talk about the governance and the back testing and the benchmarking quite a lot when it comes down to risk and regulation. The fourth point is around legal and documentation. So it could be around the documentation of CSAs and ISDAs, or maybe repo and SEC lending docs such as GMRA and GMSLA. As we move into pledge agreements as well, that's got slightly more complicated over the years, but it could be something quite as simple as playbooks and just setting up your legal team for success. Excuse me. The last one is about assurance. So fifth one is about assurance and advisory. So looking at best practices, good governance, staying ahead of the game really. You've been compliant for a while. Have you kept that compliance up? Have you looked at recent advocacy from the industry or recent best practices? Have you looked at the creation of process and policy and kept that up to date? Frankly, have you been able to pass audits internally or maybe externally? And the last one is around margin administration. So as we go through this process of people's collateral world becoming more complex, how do they cope with that? Do they outsource? Do they keep it in-source? Do they have to look at sort of what's critical, what's not critical, what's most efficient to actually offshore or outsource? And how do they do that? And what's it about? Is it around processing or is it around costs? And really, those are the 6 services, and they all interlink to collateral, margin and legal. But we believe the whole process now is front to back. I've said this many times, it's collateral coming out of silos, and that as a firm is what we're trying to achieve. We're doing that with a team, and I'm going to hand over to Chet, and he's going to talk you through what we do and who we do it with.
Thank you, Sean. Just to introduce myself, firstly, Chetan Joshi, founder of Margin Reform and also the Chief Operating Officer. So this slide here, we wanted to briefly touch on our people and our experience. You know, the people at Margin Reform are handpicked with deep and deliberate expertise in margin, collateral and legal. As you can see from our acquired experience, we've worked at a number of organizations, be it the buy side, the sell side, and that knowledge allows us to help clients accelerate with regards to their different pain points, be it technology, be it operations, be it front office, compliance. We also have a good mix of clients that we work with. So you can see the client experiences that we have with the buy side, with the sell side and technology firms and also industry bodies. So with all this experience that we have a footprint of clients all over the world. Before we want to go into the macro view, we want to give a bit of background on who we are. So thank you to Sean for that introduction. I'll now hand over to Sean to talk about the macro view.
Thanks, Chetan. So apologies to anybody who may have dialed into a couple of webinars I've been on recently. So some of this may be a bit repetitive, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail, primarily because we'll go through the detail again, but actually add a little bit because we've now gone through the half year end or the quarter end for June. So thinking about the macro environment immediately, June hasn't seen a massive liquidity crisis as we saw in March. Businesses are starting to reopen. Liquidity is still getting pumped into the system by the Fed and European governments and UK governments. So liquidity is helping. It's staving off any market constraints or dislocation, which is great. There's no reasons as we can see it for the S&P 500 to be up 40% really since March, but it is. We have to put that down to the situation of government liquidity. But frankly, what I've heard in the last 2 days, 3 days from clients and from friends in the industry is that there's no great crisis. The big crisis was in March. We move on and we hope that the balance sheet pressures that existed back in March are not repeated. So let's just focus on March again a little bit and what actually that meant, and thinking about volatility and clearing particularly. Volatility-wise, this is still going on. People are still working from home. Unprecedented times, boring word I know, and it's become the in word of everybody around COVID, but we are. Everybody's still working from home in a majority of cases, particularly in our industry. The environment brought around a load of dislocation, pricing problems, people accessing the market in March. You had the balance sheet problems of quarter end, which tend to repeat anyway every quarter end. But the dash to cash, which happened, and the Bank of England have been talking about it in this past week or two, has been quite interesting about how that manifested itself. But all of that in the front office is kind of periphery to everything that happens in collateral. So while you're funding your liquidity gets stressed and people tend to run around, actually in the back office where the biggest pain was, so that the collateral operations teams, margin operations teams, these were the guys that were under the pressure. They were doing the long hours. They were looking at different calls, looking at different structures, looking at different risks. As per normal situations, the credit teams are looking at different angles and different ways of optimizing their reporting and looking at counterparty credit risk. And again, that manifests itself in people looking at collateral because everything's collateralized these days, whether it's cleared or uncleared, and trying to understand what their position now is. So what did actually happen? And again, apologies if this is repetitive for some people. So we saw in a clearing environment, and I've got some statistics from Risk Magazine that were written by a gentleman called Amir Kawaja, who's a good friend of Margin Reforms, the CEO of Claris FT. And the interesting thing really was that the industry jumps phenomenally large. The jumps were phenomenally large. In the clearing world, the LCH volumes for US index swaps and single name swaps were up in credit terms by 89%. Euro and yen again had record months. LCH new trades, normally around 500,000, jumped 300,000 to 800,000. So that's any new trade put on in March. So that shows you that industry was having to hedge itself, to manage its portfolios, to take risk off. There was a significant number of new trades going on. At Eurex, on the cleared derivative side and exchange traded, again, volumes were up 40%. So again, massive numbers. I think this is probably a bit of a one-off, and unless we get another spike and we end up in another problem with liquidity. But with the government pumping in this amount of liquidity to the market, that seems far-fetched at this point. So that's really the clearing world. Lots going on, lots of size, lots of volume. In the bilateral world, and again, thanks to some friends of ours at Acadia Soft, we can talk through some of the statistics which you can see on your screen now. So there's three graphs here. The first graph is the margin call volumes, and you'll see there that in January, February, we were around 1 million calls a month, and in March that jumped up to about 1.8 million, so a 70% increase. Normalised again in April. I can't see the number myself here, but normalised a little bit, but again up from January and February, and I think that's been the same through April, May and June, where we've stayed at that sort of static level. So we've increased on average from 1 million to say 1.3, 1.4. Why? Well, I think the majority of that is the tier one dealers. So their average call went from 12 million a day to 60 million a day, but the average calls overall went from 3 million to 9 million. So big jumps in daily calls. Clearly with that, daily volumes go up, and that's the second graph on this chart that you can see. And you can see the monthly volume went from 1.6 trillion to 5.6 trillion. It's a huge amount of collateral, and that then takes us back into, well, how do you get the funding for that? There's a cost to that. Where's the liquidity coming from? Hence you get the liquidity crunch. Obviously since that, governments have flooded the market, therefore that liquidity crunch doesn't exist. So it all tends to tie in with the amount of free money that's been pushed into the market through QE, that we wouldn't have had that crunch. And I don't think we've had that side of calls again either, because it's not been as volatile. The last graph here is, I think, the most interesting one, because for me, it shows really what we've achieved as an industry since 2008, 2009, when we went through the GFC. If you think back, anyone was in collateral before that, then disputes were around 60, 70%. I think on average, it was a massive talking point on ISDA through the best practices. And I think one of the greatest things that came out of UMR particularly was around the initial margin model and going and building something centrally through ISDA, so the ISDA SIM model. Because what that shows us is that the tier one, phases 1 to 4, who are using Acadia and are portfolio wrecking, if you like, and have you all used the same initial margin model, that it is standing up to the process, because disputes stay very solidly at around 27, 28% between January, February and March. That is a good thing. I would have expected to have seen a spike in line with volumes and in line with the sheer size of the calls that were going through. But it shows that actually something's gone right. Now, clearly we don't know what's happened in the background at every firm. We don't know how many people they threw at the volume, whether people were brought out of projects into the line to assist with that. But it shows actually this is a solid performance, I think, from the industry and generally from margin operations. So hats off to them in everything they've done. Okay, and then so moving through from there, we're going to talk a little bit about what the regulation looked like post that, and I'll pass back to Chetan so he can talk a little bit through the regulatory upshot.
Thanks, Sean. So as Sean went through there, a lot of impacts to the market, to the front line. And what's happened from a regulatory point of view, the regulators have had to reshuffle a lot of their rules and regulations, and that's been good news for the industry. You know, we had the UMR regulation looking to go live this September. All the global regulators are now endorsing the BCBSI OSCO statement that says they need more time. So we put a high-level graphic you can see here on the bottom left, which shows all the jurisdictions who are now going ahead and changing their rules to be giving the industry more time to deal with the market volatility. So the deadline being extended creates a number of opportunities, and later on in the webinar we'll talk about the client reactions to those and what you can do with this additional time. Also, it's important to note is this delay is obviously impacting phases 5 and 6, but it's also impacting phases 1, 2, 3 and 4. And the reason I say that is when you look at the middle graph, this is a graph that we put together with data from the industry, where you can see that the first 4 phases were very, very low volume of counterparties coming into scope. But when you get to phases 5, you shift up to 250, 300 newly scoped counterparties. When you go to phase 6, you're shifting even further up to 700, 800 newly scoped counterparties. So there is going to be this big bottleneck that's going to come down the pipes for legal service providers, for technology firms, for operations, for the front office, portfolio managers. So the regulation being delayed allows people to take a step back and work out a new strategy. And also it has a knock-on effect with other regulations. So with the delay, there are opportunities for clients to get out of uncleared margin rules by looking at clearing, voluntary clearing, looking at trades that they can put through a CCP or through a clearing broker to reduce their average aggregate notional amount, which is the threshold that gets you pulled into UMR. There's also options around novations, compressions. So the number of levers you can pull from now until next year. So you have another 12 months to really reduce your footprint and your impact and your pain points to uncleared margin rules. Because getting ready for uncleared margin rules and margin reform, we see that as a typical 12-month project. It's very complex and time consuming. So this opportunity you now have is to take a step back and work out a new strategy around how you deal with UMR, but also if you look at different regulations that are coming out down the pipe. So you have SFTR, CSDR, these are around transaction reporting for the security financing transaction regulation, and the CSDR, which is around the settlements. And then you also have the benchmark reform. So a number of impacts are occurring just from the delay. And this is where there's a time to really reflect on the right strategy. And we're helping clients figure out what is the right strategy for you moving forward. So let's go to our next poll, which we'll get an idea of what people are thinking around poll 2. So Julia?
The question is, because of the regulatory extensions, you now have more time to focus on different opportunities for UMR or collateral generally. Which business opportunity is most compelling to you?
I can see the votes coming in. That's good.
Keep it coming, guys.
Yes.
Okay, so what do we see? A good split of collateral review. So the things we've been talking about, benchmarking, best practice, looking at your strategy, and the winner by 1 vote, project initiation and delivery. So getting ahead of the game, the Kickstarter. So thinking about UMR, and as we've just said, it's a 12-month project, and that's really just to do the basics to get yourself compliant. So how long left? 15 months. We're in June, we're in July. So you've got 15 months, just under, to get live by the 1st of September next year. So really, this is the time to think about initiation and delivery to kickstart where you need to get to for the 1st of September, particularly if you're phase 5. If you're phase 6, clearly not quite as urgent just yet. Okay. Thanks, Julia. Right, so as Chetan discussed, we wanted to give you some feedback on some of the client reactions we've seen since the extension a couple of months ago, and what that means, what it looks like. And we've done a pretty simple graph here. It's traffic light effects, red, amber, green. So green is where we really see clients starting to engage and thinking about this strategically. What can they do if they're phase 5, phase 6? And some of this is around new opportunities that have come out of technology. The ambers, we're getting a bit of a mixed bag. Some people are looking at it, some people are not. But we think, and clearly the reason we're putting these 5 things on there is because we think there are things to look at here. So ambers, we're not seeing that much traction. And the reds is actually where we're seeing less traction. So people have not really started looking at it in a strategic fashion yet, and we believe they should. And one of the things, and certainly some of the conversations we're having with the vendors and with some of the clients we're servicing, is that these are conversations that are probably more long-term, but in our view, that's really where we're at from an industry right now. Is you've got a long-term view, you've got a runway as a phase 5, phase 6 to do something more strategically than maybe you were going to do as a phase 5 with a shorter time frame. So we're going to go through each one of these, just explain what they are for those that don't know. I'll start with the first one, which is pre-trade analytics. Pre-trade analytics is pre-trade, obviously, and it's really there for you to have a technology provider or have a technology system that connects into all parts of your trading structure. So you might be looking at cleared derivatives or non-cleared derivatives, so bilateral. You may be using a clearing broker, more than one, or CCP, more than one. But equally, you may be able to utilize a cleared transaction, which is not mandatory. So non-deliverable forwards is a great example. They recently at LCH went through their first 1 trillion month when they're a non-mandatory product. You may be able to clear a product rather than keeping it bilateral. So what those pre-trade tools do is allow you to check where you should be executing that trade, through which clearing broker, through which CCP. The point of it is to reduce risk, reduce the amount of initial margin you're posting, and to make sure you're being optimal in the way you execute. The interesting thing from pre-trade perspective is the 50 million threshold. And that 50 million threshold, if you can not breach it, that's a good thing to do. And from a pre-trade perspective, having the technology to enable you to do that, it's out there, it exists, and lots of people are now looking at it, but we believe it's a must-have for some shops, particularly if you're pretty large and you've got a derivative portfolio that's multi-directional and you're trading with dealers, and it's more than what I would call a small book. So phase 5s are not a particularly small book. We think this is something worth looking at. Chet, and I'll leave you to talk about actually how that threshold gets managed.
Sure. I think before we go into that question, Sean, we've got a question coming from the audience. Juliet, do you want to just read out that question we've got coming through, please?
Absolutely. So the question is how the split is between IM and VM.
Sure. As we've shown on the previous slide, with variation margin, majority of clients went live with that as part of the regulation. IM has been staggered, and there are obviously 6 phases of IM. So IM clients get introduced every year. But this extension allows you to look at your variation margin portfolio and your IM portfolio and think about how you can make the right solution. So don't just think about creating a solution for IM, also think about your variation margin. Because if you think about it, when we went back to February 2017, when we went live with variation margin under Europe, everyone had to scramble and get over the line. So there's a lot of tactical solutions. So now there's an opportunity to look at those solutions and sort of replace them and make them more strategic.
I wondered, Chet, and just looking at the question, whether it was around the split of the calls and notional. It was 10 minutes ago. So I think maybe they're talking about the volume of calls, potentially. And I don't think I've got those statistics at the moment. Again, those statistics I shared for bilateral were from Acadiasoft. They may well have split them down, but I don't have that to hand.
Yeah, that's a good point, because obviously variation margin is very reactive to market movements, where the initial margin model is obviously based on the SIM, which hasn't really taken this stress event of the market volatility. So the future versions of the SIM will take into the consideration, but yeah, the majority will be the swing will be in the variation margin.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Okay, so let's look at the second area of where clients are looking at is around the IM threshold monitoring. So the IM threshold monitoring is what I see as the get out of jail card for uncleared margin rules, and it's a great little gift that the regulators gave us in the industry, where you don't necessarily have to do all the legal documentation work, you don't have to do all the custodian technology work. You can just monitor that threshold, and that threshold we're talking about is within the regulations. You're allowed to have a 50 million exposure. So you can build up your exposure to a client. As soon as you breach that 50 million, you need to have everything in place. Now, what the industry will be doing is working through what we call side letters to agree how is that going to work. So if I agree that when you get to 20 million, I'm going to send you a notice to say, look, we need to start repapering now. So a lot of clients are really looking at this, and this is in a good spot right now. And there's a number of vendors out there that we're going to talk about later on in the slide that allow you the technology to monitor your exposure as you're going through. And with the delay of the uncleared margin rules, you can actually go live from a theoretical point of view in September this year and have a parallel run for 12 months, 6 months, 9 months before you actually go live. And then you can monitor how quickly does your IM exposure increase and what's driving that. And that's great for the industry for phases 5 and 6. When we went live with Standard Chartered back in phase 1, we didn't have that luxury of time. So the IM exposure threshold monitoring service is a key thing that you should be looking at having in place with your project team, especially when you're kicking off that project. And also some of these solutions are free, and we can talk about that later on in the webinar.
So insourcing versus outsourcing. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's, do you do everything yourself internally? Have you got the structure? Have you got the people? Have you got the operating model, the governance, the policy, the process to manage initial margin and UMR compliance? Or are you looking at potentially outsourcing some of it to a custodian, to a fund administrator, to an external security services team? There are multiple various different ways you can outsource. And the question is it better for you? Is it more expensive? Is it cheaper? Is it going to be more efficient? All of those questions are challenges we think that clients should be looking at, particularly if they already have a partially outsourced model, or they outsource some part of their operational capabilities and capacity. It's, we believe, something worth looking at. That doesn't really mean take into account the technology. That's a given that you need to look at the technology and the ecosystem and how you can access the ecosystem and be in line with everybody else. This is really about post BAU and saying, how do we operate? So what does our operating model look like today? What is it going to look like on the 1st of September 21 or 22? Is it still set up for success, or do we need to do something different based on where we're at as an organisation and based on our understanding of what we want to take on. And that's really the challenge here, is making sure that your insourcing and the things you're doing internally add value, and they're competitive value adds to what you want to do as a business, versus could I get rid of something because I think it's just a process and I'm not overly worried about it, to someone else to do, and therefore the value add to me internally is quite low. And we see a lot of people having conversations about this, and there's definitely deep conversations going on in various places, but we would say if you haven't actually done some sort of review on that, it's probably worth doing internally, particularly as you come into your compliance and your compliance for UMR and various other things. It's very difficult, very similar, I guess, to the next point, which is transaction reporting and delegated reporting. You're just delegating your operational area to someone else.
Before we move on to the next one, there's another question that came in for you. So should firms continue repapering or go on hold? What is the best approach?
That's a very good question, and gets asked quite a lot by clients. So when you look at this delay, some firms have stopped their repapering and looked at kind of slowing that down. Our view is if you built up the momentum, you put together all the legal templates and the playbooks, and you've gone through all that internal conversation around what's eligible, what product's going to be in scope. Our feeling is you should continue that momentum. There will be situations where clients will say, look, we're not going to repaper anymore, but we're going to look at IM threshold monitoring. So for one of our clients, we've had a number of clients who initially were heavily engaged with us, but then when the delay announcements came out, they wanted to go into IM threshold monitoring approach. So you are going to get those scenarios, and I think it's a mixture of two approaches. Push, keep the momentum going because you have the expertise, you have the people there to help you get through it. And remember the previous slide, we have 300 clients coming into phase 5. So you want to get the repapering done on the clients that you know are going to breach that 50 million threshold. So our view at Margin Reform would be, okay, look at your clients, prioritize them with the ones you feel are going to breach the threshold, and make sure you keep the momentum, you get the repapering done because you know those ones are going to breach the 50 million very soon. The remainder, you might go on a go slow approach and look to repaper with them, or go with a side letter and a different approach around monitoring the threshold and having the technology to do that. So it's a great question from the audience there. So thank you for that question. I was going to go on to talk about transaction reporting. So this is an area that's got a lot of interest recently, mainly due to some of the announcements that come out from the industry, with the CME and Deutsche Börse Group also pulling out of transaction reporting. So lots of clients are revisiting their strategy. Like most regulations, you really bundle over the line, get it done quickly, but actually when you take a step back, could you do it in a more scalable way? Could you make it more efficient, less costly? So we are speaking to lots of clients around transaction reporting for MiFID II or for MIR. And there are some really exciting technologies that are coming out now, which can really help you go through those reporting regimes, but also look at your best execution, looking at different ways of getting data to different arms and that side of things. So transaction reporting is a key thing, and it has a link to collateral reporting as well. But we are seeing a lot of reactions and impacts around that space.
Okay, and then our last reactions around optimization. And again, this one's on red, and it's on red because we don't believe at the moment that people are focused on it enough. And optimization can be many things to many people. Frankly, I regard it as you're optimizing your front to back at all times, because collateral is a product in its own right, should be treated as a product in its own right. So if you're optimizing at the back end, you should probably be optimizing at the front end as well with the pre-trade. But in this instance, optimization, we're thinking about back end predominantly. So the basics would be cheapest to deliver, what collateral can I post to my bilateral counterparts or to my clearing houses to satisfy that obligation as cheaply as I can, and how you do that, how you set that up, how you look at your inventory and doing that holistically. So you have equities, fixed income, cash all in one place. You can understand what you can post, what's going in, what's going out. So the inventory aggregation then versus actually what am I posting, how do I post it, what algorithms am I using to satisfy that obligation, needs to be done primarily before you post anything out, because you're in this situation where funding costs are going up. Liquidity drain is happening, not at the moment, obviously, but funding costs are going up. Liquidity is not always going to be as liquid as it is today. The industry, as we know, from an initial margin perspective, for bilateral particularly, is still very heavily focused on G7 debt. And we do see that changing. We'll talk about that. And reality of that is that posting HQLA is expensive and you should be doing something cheaper. And that is being optimized. That is then knitting together your bilateral and your CCP, but also bringing into that and knitting in your repo and your securities lending business so that you've got assets that are able to be used, that are being used rather than borrowing from the street or reversing assets in when they're already on your balance sheet. So optimization is critical. Do we think is it a regulatory requirement? Well, actually it's not. But if you don't do it, then you're almost missing half the point, which is collateral is here to stay. And as a product and as a function of your business, it costs you money. And therefore being able to allocate the cost back to people putting on funding negative trades versus funding positive trades is the thing to do. And that is all part of an optimization strategy and understanding where your business loses or bleeds money through a P&L through collateral. And it's, we believe, a critical function, and it ties in with your treasury, liquidity, repo and derivative businesses at all points. So I think we're going to go into a poll here.
We got one more question come up, Sean, which was related to an earlier update. Juliet, let me take this question. So the question's come in. Are the dealers still wanting to progress repapering? Has COVID slowed down the response down significantly? So I'll just quickly touch on that. So it's been a mixed bag, and when you're on the dealer side, the way they're prioritizing their clients is obviously a different way to the way the buy side are. You know, the buy side are looking at the broker wallet, whereas the dealers obviously having different measurements around P&L around that client. So we are seeing some dealers willing to carry on repapering because that client is important to them, and others have said no, we're not going to progress. We're going to look at a side letter and look at threshold monitoring. And when you get to a certain point of 20 million, 30 million, I'm going to send you a letter and we're going to have to start repapering. And if we don't, we then will obviously send another notice and then another notice, and then we'll stop trading with you if we're not in place. So different approaches, and I guess it's based on the dealer's view on you as a buy side, you know, where you rank and their priority of, you know, 100 to 200 clients they have to get over the line in the next 2 years.
I can see one other question there, actually, Chetan, which is asking around CCPs and change to discounting rates, so risk-free rates discounting. What do I need to do to prepare with regards to current bilateral portfolio? Key challenges, risks, opportunities. Slightly confused question because it's about CCPs, but talking about the current bilateral portfolio, which would be non-cleared. I think it's talking about IBOR, the questions around IBOR. It's a great question. There's a lot going on in the IBOR space, which we're not going to get into in depth here, but suffice to say, we believe at the moment there is a little bit of crossover between what's going on in UMR world versus what's going on in IBOR world, particularly when it comes to legal documentation. With regards to the challenges, risks and opportunities, well, the challenges are, I think, very, very well documented in that it's not just about derivatives, it's about loans, securitizations, lending, mortgages, the whole retail spectrum as well. And so the risks, as far as we see them, the risks are huge. There's big legal risks in and around what you're doing, how you're doing it with clients, how the client's going to interact with the different banks. The industry seems to be split on how IBOR and risk-free rates need to work, forward-looking, backwards-looking, and there's a whole host of different things I think that need to be solved before we even get to a point of it being an acceptable solution for everybody. And I don't think we'll ever get to an acceptable solution for everybody, but it's a very big topic, very large topic. I don't really want to go into any more detail than that. It may be something we talk about in the future on a webinar with some different people who've got more experience in it right now than we have, but it's a massive question, but there's definitely some similarities there between what's going on in that space and what's going on in the UMR space.
Yeah, and I'll just add, with benchmark reform, there's a lot of discussions with the dealers. There is a bit of a gap around the buy side voice, and we're hearing a lot from our buy side clients who want to understand how does it really impact the buy side. And I think there's a gap there where we're going to be working with, like Sean said, experts in the space, in the industry, to try to help get a voice for the buy side around what impact it has around benchmark reform. You know, Sean mentioned around documentation, we talk about pricing impacts, etc. So there's a lot to do in the space. Okay, I think we now move on to the next slide, which will talk about what's going on in industry. So we wanted to give everyone an update. There's so much going on now with obviously webinars, virtual conferences, magazine articles, with everyone being online, there's a lot of information. We wanted to use this opportunity as part of our monthly series of webinars to give you the industry chit chat, not chit chat, but the industry chit chat. And we want to go through kind of three kind of key areas. That the first area is around what we've liked and what we've seen is a positive for the industry. The middle section is talking about key updates, messages that we're seeing from key industry bodies, key players, governments, etc. And then the final area is around what we love and what we think is really positive for the industry. So we're not going to go through every single one here, but myself and Sean will just take one or two from each and just sort of expand on that. So from the first kind of column, for me, it's around the kind of the ecosystem. So we at Margin Reform, we have a good view of the collateral ecosystem, not just for margin, but for legal and for clearing. And we can share this later on. We have a diagram which shows a number of companies. And over the last 4 or 5 years, those technology companies and service providers have all got closer and closer together and created a lot of interoperability. And we've seen some recent news, with Acadius integrating fully with Cassini, Open Gamma around the CRIF file. This is the file that you need to compute the sensitivities that will calculate the initial margin, but also the sensitivities that go into the reconciliation platforms. So we've seen that integration with the ecosystem. We've also seen Open Gamma and IHS Market announce their partnership around pre-trade analytics. So this is something we've been talking about for a number of years, where we are going to see this kind of the connection point of all these providers, making it easier for you as a buy side or a sell side, connect to that ecosystem, have that interoperability, that straight through processing with the right technology strategy. But it's not just technology, there's also the legal service providers also working closely together, and the custodians. And let's not forget about the custodians, because they're the key players in the whole of initial margin, because it's got to be segregated at their accounts. And that whole space is going to get very, very complicated as you move into phase 5 and 6, when you go to a third party or tri-party model with multiple new custodians coming in. So that's a good news for us that we're seeing those announcements.
Yeah, so the point I think I'd pull out of that, Chetan, is totally selfish and is related to margin reform. We have hired a new resource. So a lady called Des Kalikova has joined Margin Reform, and she's heading up our business development and consultancy in Europe. Based in Paris, Des has joined us with 15 years experience in collateral margin and lots of buy-side experience, sell-side experience and consultancy experience. So very exciting times for us here at Margin Reform as we try to work with our European clients with a more localized approach. So very happy about that.
Yeah, great, nice. The next area is around what I want to pull out is the updates that have come out from ISDA Create. So just to give people a recap, ISDA Create is a groundbreaking technology in the legal documentation space, which is obviously with ISDA and the Linklaters and their technology arm called Nakoda. Now, ISDA Create is constantly building new enhancements, and it allows organizations to, for certain criteria, so if you're a buy side, it's no cost to minimal cost for you to join ISDA Create. And it's working purely on the initial margin documents, but they have a roadmap to variation margin documents, etc. So if you have no technology from a legal point of view to store your documents, this is a great place for you to store those documents. You can also outsource that to a service provider that can negotiate for you online. So we've seen a few relationships being negotiated, and that's a real big area that's going to really grow as we get into phases 5 and 6.
Thank you. So the things I'm going to move right across and don't pull out any more of those points. If anyone wants to address any of those points with us in the middle before we close, then please do come with some questions, or after the event, it's fine. But I want to talk about a couple of things on the right-hand side, stuff we love. So the additional planning and delivery time for regulators, if that's not obvious by now that we think it's a good thing, we think it's very positive, we think it's great for the industry. Clearly there's some stresses for some people, but for most it's probably a good thing, and we believe strategically it's a good thing. And then the eligible collateral for initial margin. And I know we've had a question about how does that look from the sell side? Are they looking at increasing or decreasing amending their eligible collateral schedules? And I'll come to that again in a little bit. But again, we think that's something positive. It gives people time to understand what they can post, how they can post it, where they can source it. And it all falls back into that optimization strategy that we talked about earlier, or I talked about earlier. And how does your inventory look, and what can you access to post as collateral, and can you, doing it in a succinct and optimized way, how does that make it better for you from a financial perspective?
While you're talking about, there's a question coming in around eligible collateral. So the question is, are you seeing any change in strategy at clients with their eligible collateral policy due to the delay to the reg date and impact of COVID?
I'm not sure changing strategy and policy at the moment. I think it's a good question. So what I would say to that is that it might not be the strategy that's changing internally, it just might be the ratings externally. So if we think about some of the government ratings over the next 6 months and what's likely to happen from a credit perspective and a risk perspective, are we likely to see issuer risk downgrades, so country downgrades? Yes. Therefore, is that going to push certain governments into changes in eligible collateral schedules, or push them down out of investment grade, potentially? So I think that's one challenge. I think the wider challenge from eligible collateral schedules is around the phase 1, 2s and the phase 5, 6 negotiations. I'm not sure that's COVID driven. I think that is around access, pricing, ease of pricing, ability to price in default. So I think that's a different question to COVID, but there are some challenges between those that are compliant already with UMR and those that are going to have to be compliant over the next 2 years, and what that looks like within the collateral schedule. Yes.
Yeah, we're also seeing some clients look at their policy around the concentration limits of eligible collateral and potentially reducing and having more of a tighter limit for certain regions or certain countries. And that's quite new that we've seen since the COVID. It's obviously not related, is it? But that's quite interesting. That's been breaking recently with some clients.
Yeah, fair.
Okay, so the final piece I wanted to put out here, which there's a lot of conversations around margin admin, so margin administration. So there's a big debate going on with a number of clients that we speak to around insourcing or outsourcing, and it can get very complicated. And there are a number of solution providers out there. And we at Margin Reform strongly believe that the ecosystem can allow you to get capability very quickly at a very good price. So you can outsource a lot of this to certain service providers, and allow you to focus on your BAU, your business as usual, and allow the kind of the rest of the ecosystem to kind of take all the processing away, not just for IM, but also for variation margin. And also then you can look to build in repo, clearing, exchange traded derivatives once you build that new kind of platform. So we are helping clients look through the pros and cons of insourcing and outsourcing. And it's definitely a big area when you look at the volume of clients coming up with phases 5 and 6. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide.
So here we'll talk about the white paper, our new upcoming collateral survey for the industry, both the buy side and the sell side, and how to book a complimentary discovery call. I'm going to throw these questions out to Sean and Chetan. Can you tell us more about the white paper and what is the benefit of the survey?
Yeah, okay, let me take the white paper. So the white paper is around collateral and collateral optimization particularly. So we are looking at money market funds. So money market funds have been discussed across the industry for the last 12 to 18 months, both for bilateral and for CCPs actually, but we're focused on bilateral here. We believe that adding different products, different capabilities to your collateral pool is a positive for optimization. It's a positive for those that might want to post cash instead of bonds or equities. It's a positive in that you can't really post cash. That's not really open to you today. It's not really offered as a solution. So money market funds are a very obvious solution to being able to utilize cash to post initial margin. So the point of the white paper is really to give insights into what money market funds are available to post, because there is a big issue between the EU and US. So there is some focus on that, but not a lot. We believe it's very positive for EU funds, EU clients and EU banks, etc., to post to each other, as long as you're not crossing the Atlantic. But it goes into a lot of detail about how it works from a custody perspective, how you would allocate, and how you can utilise those money market funds to satisfy your initial margin posting requirements for phase 5s and phase 6s. Phase 1s to 6s actually. It's not strictly for anybody outside of IM, but it's really the opportunity to be able to utilise a different product for IM purposes.
Thanks, Sean. So the industry survey is what we're looking to kick off after this webinar with our clients and people on this webinar. And the reason we want to kick off this industry survey is, as you've seen from the reactions, lots of clients are thinking about what is the priority for me now. I have more time. Can I reallocate that budget? Where do I reallocate it? Do I reallocate it into optimization, looking at my cleared and my bilateral? Do I move it into my technology, looking at different technologies to remove some of the manual processing? So what we wanted to do is help our clients by creating an industry-wide survey, which then gives them a free report, which they can consume internally and go to their management team and say, look, our peers are investing in X, Y, and Z areas, and I think we feel we should be doing the same, or they get some intel what people are doing. So this industry survey will be going out to everyone that's on this webinar to participate. It'll be anonymous, and we'll then send you the analysis with a free report to show you the key answers from the questions.
Great. And lastly, on this point, so how do we get this information, and how do we find you?
So, go on, Chet, do you want to do that one?
Yeah. So we're offering. There's a lot of content that we've tried to cram into this 50 minutes, and a lot of it it's going to resonate with people. It might not resonate with people, but we're offering a complimentary discovery call that can be 30 minutes, 60 minutes, where we can just talk through some of these themes, these areas and reactions, and really kind of help you look at your strategy, look at where you're going forward. Where you can find us, we're on LinkedIn. So at the end of this slide, we have our contact details. You can see us follow us on our company page at Margin Reform, and also on our website. So on our website, we have a mailing list. We'll be publishing our white papers. So as registrants, you're going to get exclusive access to this white paper around money market funds. But if you join into our mailing list, you'll get updates around our events and our new white papers that are coming up.
Great, thank you for that. So we have our last poll to do. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So our next webinar will be on the 6th of August. Which topic would be most interesting for you?
Loads of votes coming in now. Thank you.
About 50% now, just going over 50%. If anyone else wants to submit their ideas, this would be really helpful for us. Okay, the results are in.
Dun, dun, dun.
Custodial insights and challenges seems to have come out on top, and I guess that's because we've got some phase 5s, phase 6s on who might be thinking about tri-party, third party, and then we've got some split votes really across the clearing world, industry and regulatory in the future, and fintech and the ecosystem. So some broad answers actually. There's clearly a lot of interest in collateral margin, which is obviously the reason that Chetan and I have created Margin Reform. So that's good to see. Thanks, Juliet.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the live Q&A. We do have a little bit of time left. So if anybody has some further questions, please send it through the Q&A functionality. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'd love to hear from you.
So there's one there now, Juliet, which I'll take, which is how important is collateral optimization for fixed income, where rates are zero and yield curve flat? It's a good question. It wouldn't seem it's that important, primarily because rates are zero and yields flat. Rates go to negative, it becomes important because it costs you money. So a couple of things I'll take out of that question. One, it's not just about fixed income. Full optimization is around fixed income, it's around cash, it's around equity. So you'd be wanting to work out whether there is a way to source those assets if they were indeed cheaper than fixed income. But it's a valid point, but I don't expect rates to be zero forever, and maybe I do, based on where we're at. But rates are clearly going north at some point. The opportunity to get yourself ready from an optimization perspective is probably better when times are not quite as challenging as they might be when rates are not zero and the yield curve isn't flat, and therefore there's a larger cost. That's probably the time you don't want to be doing it. It's the time you want to be fully optimized. So I guess my response to that is, yeah, it's a valid point, but now is the time to think strategically about what it is you're doing and how you do it, rather than waiting for times to be more challenging and harder to get that stuff through. With all of this stuff, and I guess just to reiterate, UMR is a regulation, right? You have to be regulatory compliant. Optimization, you don't. If you are thinking strategically about how you operate your business, then the way to get money and to get funding for your business is to do it through regulation, right? That is how banks, how buy sides, how people are funding their projects and their programs. So if you want to optimize in the future and you want to future-proof yourself, then the chances of you doing that now and getting the funding for that now are better than asking for it in 2 or 3 years' time when there's another regulation coming along or another project coming along that is going to take precedent over collateral because you've spent money 2-3 years ago. So I think the view is try and fund yourself now to get that and give yourself a glide path into what that might look like in 21, 22 and onwards, next 5 years, I would say.
We have another salient question. What distinguishes you from your competitors?
Sure. So it's a great question. The key factors to think about here is that myself and Sean ran the UMR project for Standard Chartered Bank, which is a phase 1 dealer from 1 to 4. So we've been there. It's practitioner led, so we're not pure consultants. In that sense, we've built the practitioner experience and then complement that with consultancy experience. We talked earlier about our people have deep and deliberate expertise. So we're not just looking at UMR. We have depth in securities, repo financing. We have depth in clearing, assurance, advisory. So there's a number of professional service areas that we offer. Also, our network with industry. We're delivery partners for the leading technology firms out there. So all the world-class technology firms, we're part of their either their delivery program or very closely linked to them. So we are very different in that sense. Myself and Sean together, we have 40 years experience in this space. Sean, if you want to add anything else.
I don't look old enough to have that amount of experience, but no, it's a valid point, Chet. And the reason we went into this and being very candid is because we've both worked in organisations where we've sat across with people who know less than us that are selling consultancy. So the point of margin reform is to bring consultancy collateral margin consultancy out of the dark ages, so that clients can work with practitioners who bring the expertise of 20 years plus each, plus our deep expertise in our team to assist you. The point, I think, of a consultancy is for the consultancy to lead the client and tell them where they need to be heading, not for the client to be telling us what to do. That's really the wrong way around, but that's generally how consultancy has worked for me in my 20, 25, maybe 30 years in banking.
So, any other questions that we want to go over?
Do you want to take the one on SIM model approval, Chetan?
Yeah, sure. So the questions come in around the SIM model approval is mandatory requirement for the US rules. Any intel on whether this is likely to also become a requirement for the EU rules? For now, it's not. So that's correct. So under the EU rules or under the Asian rules, you don't need to get a regulatory approval. You just need to provide an attestation. So you need to prove to the regulator that you have the right governance and control in place, but you don't get a stamp of approval like you do in the US. But when we talk to our contacts in Europe, the supervisory bodies out there are looking to publish the mere refit, and it's been delayed, and due to COVID, they've had to reshuffle the packs. And we know that beginning of next year is when they're looking to go into consultation with the market around that. So there is a lot of lobbying around phases 5 and 6, not to go through the model approval or back testing and benchmarking, but at the moment it's still a requirement and it's something we should monitor. And we're hoping, hopefully in the future, to get some more announcements in our webinars and potentially even get one of the kind of key people from the supervisory areas in Europe to give us an update.
Cool. So there's a couple of questions coming up. We probably need to make this the last one based on where we're at, but it covers a couple of angles. So we've had one question around the update on equity options and the exclusion from the EU and the temporary exclusion going out till January. And also one about the intergroup margin exemption, which goes out till January as well. Where do we see the market going? How market participants manage their risk internally? Both of those derogations come to an end, as you say, in 6 months. What do we see happening? For equities, on both of them, in fact, ISDA are lobbying very hard with the industry to get get the equities excluded permanently and to get intergroup in line with the US. So we're looking for some proper feedback from regulators. But I think the challenge right now is that the COVID situation has meant that everything's been reshuffled, as Chetan's said. So I guess my expectation would be that we get another year derogation and they extend it out another year to give themselves proper time to look at it. They've clearly come to the table in extending all regulations that we talked about here. And I think actually this was just going to be it's an easiest thing for them to do is just to extend it once more. They did it lots of time for clearing, half a dozen, if not more time they did that. So I think they'll do that. I think they'll extend again, give the industry more time to build up its lobbying, its case for excluding completely. But yeah, there's a lot to work through just generally in regulation. So that's my view on it. The other question around the second part of the question, how will market participants manage their risks? We can come back to that one offline, I think. There is an answer, it's just too long for here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much from me, for everyone dialing in. We will be sending out a recording after the event and the contact details are on the slides. We'll also forward out the white paper that we've discussed today. Thank you very much for joining us. Our next webinar is on the 6th of August and we will have a season of 6 webinars now through to December. Maybe the last one will be a Christmas party, but we'll have to wait and see. But thank you very much for your time. Hope you've enjoyed it and we welcome any feedback. Thank you very much.